Anne was born in 1515 in Dusseldorf. She was brought up strictly, but not well educated. She did not speak English, which was not unreasonable for a girl not from England, but it certainly would not help her situation when she later became Queen of England. Her father was John, Duke of Cleves, Cleves being a former state of Germany. His son and Anne's brother William became the Duke after the death of John in 1539, and William would have been highly involved in the negotiations for Anne's marriage to Henry. One of the earliest things known about Anne was that at the age of 11 she was betrothed to Francis, Duke of Lorraine. But this betrothal didn't last long. It was sometime around 1539 when negotiations with Cleves and England started for a possible marriage. Alliance with Protestant Germany was attractive to Henry and his Chancellor Thomas Cromwell, who championed the match, because they were worried about being isolated in Europe against Catholic Spain and France. Fun fact, although Anne's family were mostly Protestant, her mother was actually Catholic. She had most influence over Anne in her young years, so it's possible that Anne herself had Catholic beliefs. Looks were clearly important to Henry. He was determined to have a wife he found attractive. Now this does not seem unreasonable, but with only portraits to judge from, it made it hard to arrange. He considered many European princesses. However, Henry's actions in murdering one of his wives, not surprisingly, meant many of the suggested women weren't really that keen on taking the role of his next wife. Once Cleves was in the mix for Henry's next queen, Henry had the artist Holbein travel to Cleves to paint a portrait of Anne as well as her sister Emilia. It seemed a case of which portrait Henry liked most. He gave instructions to the artist not to flatter in his work. In the famous portrait, Anne looks neither beautiful nor ugly, but something about the image clearly took Henry's fancy. Arrangements were made, and Anne left Cleves for her new home in England. She would never return home or see her family again. The first meeting between Henry and Anne was a complete disaster. Henry, always the showman, loved to dress up and pretend to be some handsome stranger, and everyone at court would play along because he was the king, and everything about court life was about being in his favour. But Anne knew nothing about any of this. So when at Rochester they first met, Anne is unaware that the man who enters the room is Henry, and then when he kissed her and offered her a token, as if from the king, she reacted with shock and embarrassment and possible disgust. So awkward was this first meeting that after a brief acknowledgement she basically ignored him. Henry was used to having everyone playing along. He was angry and embarrassed. He returned shortly after in royal dress as himself. Anne would have realised what happened and likely would have been mortified. It was a terrible start, and her lack of English would have made it hard to smooth over this awkward situation. Was it because of this terrible start to the relationship? Or was it because of how Anne looked? We can't be sure, but what we are sure of is that Henry didn't like Anne. He was furious, and he felt he had been tricked into the match. He took out his anger on Cromwell, but it seems he didn't hold Holbein responsible due to the fact that the artist remained in his pay for a long time after all this happened. So was Anne as bad as Henry said? Reports about her were that she was not unattractive, and certainly not as bad as he thought. Beauty, of course, is in the eye of the beholder, and others described her as fair and lovely, although older and solemn. But regardless of anyone else's opinion, the only opinion that mattered was Henry's. On top of all this, she was not well educated like some of Henry's previous wives. She was unable to speak English well. Everything about her made Henry more angry. It was a doomed match. Thomas Cromwell had strongly made a case for the match, as he wanted to make sure England had a strong alliance in case Spain and France teamed up and attacked England. Cromwell was not born high, but he was highly educated and rose to power working for former Chancellor Cardinal Wolsey. Henry's reaction was a disaster for Cromwell. He must have been under horrendous pressure, as Henry told him find a way for him not to marry Anne. But the political effects of that and breaking the alliance were too dangerous for England. Therefore, Henry married Anne on the 6th of January 1540. Anne was about 24, Henry was 48. Henry wanted Anne gone and told his lawyers to find a way to have the marriage annulled. He said the marriage was never consummated and therefore not valid. Anne seems to have been a bit confused and unaware of the danger of the situation. She supposedly told one of her ladies the only contact they had was a kiss goodnight. Was Anne incredibly naive? Even by the standard of the times, she must have had some awareness of how a marriage worked and how to get pregnant. Or had her strict upbringing left her totally unprepared, with no one ever educating her properly? Whatever the truth, with the marriage never consummated, Anne's position was very dangerous. Henry was determined to get out of this marriage. Ultimately, the lack of consummation, as well as Anne's prior betrothal to the Duke of Lorraine, were the reasons used to end the marriage. When Anne was told about the situation, she didn't fight it, and on the 24th of June, Anne was told to leave the court. For such willing surrender, she was gifted with money and properties, and she would have been known moving forward as the king's sister. This was actually a pretty good result for Anne, as she was able to live as a wealthy private woman. She actually managed to form somewhat of a friendship with Henry, and she would visit court from time to time and be shown great respect by him. Cromwell did not fare so well. For his part of the arrangement of the marriage, he would lose his life. Anne seems to have had a generally good relationship with Henry's 3 children, as she continues to be mentioned in court records after his death. She eventually died during Mary's reign, possibly of cancer, and she was the last of Henry's queens to die. So was Anne a victim or a winner of this crazy situation? She was probably a bit of both. It must have been humiliating and lonely for her, but she came out quite well and still alive, unlike some of Henry's other queens. I can't help but feel some sympathy for her, and admire the way she dealt with this tricky situation. I also feel she probably had a very lucky escape.